Hello, and welcome to this, the third lesson of A.K. Warder's Grammar Guide, An Introduction to Pali. Lesson 3 is actually really short, covering the declension of just a few common nouns, and then the 7th verb conjugation class. So let's go through it. This is Pali Studies on the Learn Pali channel. Lesson 3 begins with a look at the declension of 3 very common nouns. They're all masculine, but we should be careful here to distinguish between them because Bhagavant is actually from a different class to the other two. Bhagavant is actually an adjective. It's formed by adding the possessive suffix vant to the noun bhaga, which means good fortune or luck, and nouns which end with vant have the meaning possessing that quality, and these can often be rendered into English by words which end ed, and so this is commonly translated as blessed or fortunate. Importantly, any adjective term in Pali can also stand alone as a substantive in its own right, and then means the one or the person who possesses that quality, and so from this we get the blessed one or the fortunate one. Well, that's the stem, so let's now look at how it's declined. Bhagavant belongs to a group of nouns which all end ant. Warder here drip feeds us the cases, so we only have the nominative and the accusative cases. But we can see in the accusative singular it takes the ang ending, like we've seen with the a-stem nouns, but the singular nominative and the plural are actually the other way round to the masculine a-stem. Here long A marks the singular and O marks the plural. And the plural form is common to both the accusative and nominative cases, which sometimes can lead to problems when distinguishing plural subjects from plural objects. And only context will tell you which is correct. Now, I actually used the word Bhagavant in an example back in Lesson 1, when we were looking at the concept of the historic present. And now we have a little bit more information, we can analyse it a bit further. Ekang Samayang begins almost every sutta. This is in the accusative case, and it's actually acting adverbially, setting the time at which the following passage took place. And then we have Bhagava, which we now know is the nominative singular, meaning the Blessed One. And this is a common title given to the Buddha. Next there's usually a location given, and the verb he abides. And although this verb is in the present tense, we know from the adverb at the beginning this is actually recounting a past event, and so is an example of what we call the historic present. Now, Brahman and Rajan actually belong to a different group of nouns which end with an. And again here Warder only gives us the singular, nominative and accusative case, but I've put in the plural here too. And so we can see that in the accusative singular these end ang, and in the nominative singular they end in a long a, and in the plural in o. But it's worth pointing out here that these declensional endings apply if the noun is used by itself in a sentence, but when they form the last part of a compound word, which we'll look at in a later lesson, the compounds actually follow the declension of normal masculine a-stem nouns like loka. So just bear this in mind, that even though Warder here presents them together and they look superficially similar, they're actually from different declension groups. Now moving on. Before we look at the 7th conjugation class, it's perhaps worth talking about the numbering schemes. Unfortunately, the ancient Pali grammarians used more than one scheme of classification. For instance, if we compare Moggallana to Kaccayana, we can see that Kaccayana splits the 5th class into 2, so his scheme numbers from 1 to 8, whereas Moggallana's numbers from 1 to 7, and Warder numbers his from 1 to 7 too. Now, because Pali and Sanskrit share the same roots, you may see these classes compared to Sanskrit's 10 classes. So that's actually a lot of numbers. and as it's the norm to refer to a conjugation class merely by its number, this is ripe for confusion. And added to this, the 4 subdivisions of the first conjugation are in some modern grammar guides brought out as classes in their own right, and so they number from 1 to 10. And this shouldn't be confused with those of Sanskrit. Well, thankfully, learning the enumeration of these classes is not important, just to be aware of the possible confusion when you switch between texts. It's also important to understand that what we're calling a class here is really just a group of verbs which share a method of forming their present stem from a given root. And some roots form present stems according to several of the methods, and so in effect belong to multiple classes. Okay, well that's a bit of an overview. Now if you remember back to lesson 1, we looked at the first verb class, and in lesson 3, Warder details the 7th class. So, like the first conjugation, if you want to form a present stem from a root which belongs to the 7th conjugation class, first you strengthen the root vowel, which means that E and U are strengthened to E and O. However, unlike the first conjugation, verbal roots which contain the vowel A are often lengthened to a long A. And once we've strengthened the radical vowel, then one of 2 suffixes are added, either A or ea, and those in A are far more common. And of course there are some roots where the radical vowel is unaffected by the strengthening and just take the suffixes. It's also worth noting that many verbs of this group are often what's called secondary derivatives, specifically causatives and denominative verbs, that is, a verb formed from a noun, and we'll see these in the later lesson too. So, this then gives us the present stem, and to this stem we have to add the primary personal endings in order to form a conjugated verb. Now, as I've said before, it's not really important to understand how a present stem is formed from a root, but what is important is understanding that to the present stem you add a specific inflectional ending which agrees with the subject in person and number. And finally, it's also worth pointing out here that the Pali English Dictionary often doesn't have a separate entry for the ea derivation of the 7th class, and so it's always worth checking under the A version of the stem. Well, that was lesson 3, short and sweet. Warder gives us some more vocabulary to learn, and this is followed by exercise 3. And as always, there's a link below in the description to both the source text and the answers to the last exercise, lesson 2. And in the next lesson we'll be learning about the aorist inflection. So stay tuned by checking out some of my other tutorials.